Well, it's definitely nice to peruse your local bike shop and even purchase a fully assembled bike that same day. Now, more than ever, it's increasingly likely that you'll order a bike from an online retailer and still need to assemble it once it arrives at your home. Now, whether you recently got a bike to get some exercise during the COVID era, or you bought a used bike that was shipped to your home, assembling a bike from the box isn't too complicated. Of course, you can always pay a local shop to build your bike, but I'd say if you have any inclination to try and you have the basic tools required, which aren't many, you ought to give it a shot. You'll certainly learn more about your bike and perhaps appreciate it that little bit more. If this is your first time here, thanks for dropping in. This channel features reviews, how-tos, and nerdy deep dives into the world of cycling, all filtered through this extra average cyclist with a technical background. If you like this type of content, then subscribing to the channel is the best way to show your support and to make sure you don't miss out on future videos like this. It's not as daunting as you think to build a bike from a box, as it will come mostly assembled already. Things like wheel building, wheel truing, wrapping handlebars, installing shifters and drivetrain bits, installing tires or running brake and shift lines will most likely already have been done. In fact, most manufacturers will actually build the entire bike first for quality assurance purposes and then partially disassemble it for shipping. The tools required are going to be a basic set of metric Allen wrenches in sizes from about 2 to 8 millimeters, a torque wrench, and a bike pump. A bike workstand is really nice to have, but it's not absolutely necessary. Now, usually when you order a bike, it'll arrive in one big box, but this 2020 Ritchey Outback that was generously sent over for review came in 2 separate boxes, which actually means that some of the following steps might be unnecessary if your bike came in one box. Now regardless, the first thing you want to do is to pull the whole bike out, which will usually be in one unit with several components strapped to the frame. Generally, the seat post will already be attached to the saddle, but the whole unit will be separate from the bike. So the next thing you want to do is to secure the seat post into the frame, making sure to use grease if both the frame and the post are alloy, or carbon grip paste if either the frame, the seat post, or both are carbon fiber. The grease on metal-to-metal interfaces prevents seizing so that you can actually remove the seat post later, and the carbon grip paste increases friction between carbon parts to prevent slippage while riding. And once the seat post is in the frame, the next thing I always do is to hang the whole thing on a workstand. At this point, you can start removing the protective packaging and set it aside. Most of the pieces will pull right off, but occasionally you'll need to cut a piece of tape to remove some packaging. In this case, be really careful not to scratch your frame or any of the components. As I mentioned, most bikes ship in one big bike box, partially assembled, which also means that the rear wheel is usually already mounted to the frame, and the fork and the handlebars are already installed. The front wheel is usually the only thing you'll need to attach to the bike before you can start making adjustments. In my case, because this bike shipped in 2 smaller boxes, the fork and the handlebars actually need to be installed first. The order of installation, should you need to do this part, is the crown race, cartridge bearing, lower race, the frame head tube, then on top of that will be the upper race, the top cartridge bearing, a compression ring, a dust cover, followed by a combination of stem and spacers, and then the top cap. For now, I'm just going to put a spacer or 2 above and below the stem and top it off with the headset top cap, which will hold everything together until later when I set the stem height and do the final bike fit. For the moment, I also won't worry about headset preload or the bars being perfectly straight, as that'll be one of the last things that we do. Up next, in my case, I need to install the wheels, but first, I need to install the disc rotors, which are removed for safe transport. Most of the time, the rotors will be installed already, but technically it is safer to remove them, as is the case here. Now these are center lock disc rotors as opposed to your traditional 6-bolt rotor, which means either a cassette tool or a deep bottom bracket tool is likely required to install them. You want to apply a bit of grease to the hub interface and torque the lock rings down to the proper spec, making absolutely certain not to get grease anywhere near the rotor braking surfaces. Now at this point I can go ahead and install the wheels using the supplied through axles and inflate the tires to the desired pressure. Give the wheels a spin and check the brakes. I'm looking for the rotors to be centered between the pads, which should already be installed in the calipers. If they aren't centered and you get some rubbing, then now is the time to align the calipers about the rotors. It's most often going to be a pair of 4 or 5 millimeter Allen bolts that secure the caliper to the frame. You can also buy a caliper centering tool, which is basically just a pair of shims that straddles the rotor as you tighten the caliper to maintain an even distance on either side of the braking surface. In my case, I don't have one of these tools, but I can usually align the calipers without it. Now once the wheels are on and the brakes are set up, it's time to set up the drivetrain. Most often, bikes won't actually ship with any pedals. Now this is because manufacturers know that pedals and shoes are about as personal as your choice of cycling kit, so they don't even bother to try. Now I still prefer to use my standard bulletproof SBD pedals from nearly 15 years ago, and I'm just transferring these over to this bike from my Diverge. Again, this is a spot where grease is your friend, as you don't want to have to fight against pedals that have seized up in the cranks. Remember too that pedals are left-right specific, and the non-drive side pedal is always a reverse thread. It's helpful to use the opposing crank or the rear wheel itself for leverage when tightening the pedals, and for God's sakes, please be careful to avoid the dreaded knuckle buster here. Now usually at this point you can start adjusting the derailleur tension and limit screws and dial in the shifting, but in my case the derailleur was actually removed before shipping, again to spare damage to the derailleur hanger. Now this is pretty simple to install. It's just a single bolt, usually a 5 or 6 millimeter, and it threads directly onto the derailleur hanger. Now once the derailleurs and pedals are installed, you can go ahead and adjust the gears. Now I won't go into too much detail here on how to do this, as it would be better served by a standalone video. But a couple of tips are, first, to set the system tension with the chain in the second smallest cog on the cassette. Now this is because the chain position on the smallest and the largest cogs are affected by both the shift cable tension and the limit screws on the rear derailleur, and you want to isolate the variables when initially setting up your tension. Another pro tip here is to pre-stretch your cables. Now on this bike, it's likely that the cables are aged and already stretched, but brand new cables will stretch by a lot over the first few hours of riding. Now if you take this step up front, you can almost entirely eliminate the initial cable stretch period if you stretch them out manually by shifting to a larger cog or chainring without pedaling. What this does is that it pulls the inner shift cables really tight and it stretches them out. Alternatively, if the shift cables are actually exposed, you can literally grab them and pull them outward with enough force to stretch them out. Now personally, I never recommend doing any derailleur adjustments until the shift cables are sufficiently stretched, as you'll just end up having to redo all that work once they eventually do stretch out. Now with the brakes and shifters dialed in, you're almost done, and you can bring the bike off the stand and onto the ground. Now the last thing you want to do is to set up the bike fit. If you already know your measurements, then now is the time to dial in those settings like saddle height, saddle position fore and aft, as well as saddle angle. You can also now set up your stem and handlebars how you like them as well. You may find that you need to adjust the amount of headset spacers above or below the stem to get the handlebar height just right. You can also adjust the handlebar angle up or down, as well as dial in the position of the controls on the handlebars themselves. And once you have everything where you like it, you'll need to preload your headset and make sure your handlebars are perfectly straight. Now the top cap on the headset is what sets the preload, and generally you want to tighten the cap until you just meet a bit of resistance and then turn it just a tad more. The indicator that your preload is properly set is that your handlebars can rotate freely and smoothly with zero play in the system. Now once your preload is set, you can go ahead and align the handlebars perfectly straight and tighten the stem pinch bolts to the proper torque spec. And believe it or not, that's about it. At this point, you should be just about ready to go. If you typically use accessories like bottle cages, frame bags, or other bags, you can install those as well. But otherwise, you ought to take it for a spin and just see how it rides. Note that if the bike is truly brand new, you will want to give it a pretty thorough service after a couple of weeks to check the torque specs on all the key bolts, as well as adjust cable tension to keep the shifting dialed in. And while most wheels are pretty well built from the factory, it's also likely that spoke tension may be out, and it shouldn't surprise you if the wheels aren't perfectly straight after your first 50 or 100 miles. Now other than that, there's not much else to it. So kudos to you if you took the plunge and built your own bike from the box. There's certainly an element of pride when working on your own bikes, and assembling your bike from the box is definitely a good starting point. Okay, so that's going to do it for this one. If you have a minute, you can check out some other how-tos in this playlist over here. And as always, thanks for watching, and thanks for subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.